I can still picture those images from April 1982. They're just so visceral. You have Leopoldo Galtieri in full uniform on a balcony speaking to these absolutely euphoric crowds.
Yeah, it was like they just won the World Cup. Total jubilation.
Total jubilation, but then that feeling just evaporates and you get the brutal reality of war. The low-flying Argentine jets, the news reports of ships sinking.
Especially the cruiser, the General Belgrano. That was a massive blow.
And then there's that one indelible image of an injured British soldier, leg broken, being hoisted up to a helicopter. It was a short, brutal war over a place most people couldn't find on a map.
Exactly, the Malvinas or the Falklands War. And it turned into this crucible moment for two nations, two very different governments, and it all centered on this tiny remote piece of land.
So in this deep dive, our mission is to cut straight through all that noise. We're going to unpack the centuries of history behind the Argentine claim, the British possession, and, the fatal political math that led to the 1982 war.
And we have to remember the geopolitical backdrop here. I mean, you had intense peace efforts from people like Javier Pérez de Cuellar at the UN.
The Peruvian president, Fernando Bellón de Terry, was also involved.
Right, and the U.S. Secretary of State, Alexander Haig. All of this was happening while Argentina's dictatorship was in a deep, dark crisis, the years of the disappeared. And Margaret Thatcher's government in the UK was, well, on shaky ground.
Okay, so let's start with the core legal dispute, because when it comes to who actually owns this archipelago, you have two completely different legal worldviews just smashing into each other.
It's fascinating because we're not talking about a minor border issue. These are two fundamentally different ways of looking at sovereignty. The Argentine position is based on a principle called ut possidetis juris.
Okay, that's a complicated term. Break that down for us.
Right. So simply put, it means as you possess, you may possess. The theory says that when a new state like Argentina emerges from an old empire, in this case Spain, it automatically inherits the borders and territory the old empire held.
So because the islands were part of the Spanish viceroyalty, Argentina claims they inherited them in 1810, a kind of legal continuity.
Exactly. It's based on colonial maps and domains.
And the British position just throws that all out. They focus on something called effective control.
Right. For the British, it's all about who was actually there, exercising constant, effective control. They point to their colonists, their civil administration, their military presence. For them, what's happening on the ground today matters more than old colonial maps.
So these two abstract legal ideas are the reason for 150 years of diplomatic stalemate.
That's the core of it, yeah.
Okay, let's go back into the mists of time a bit and see how this actually played out. Who was there first? Because even the claims of discovery are messy.
They are messy, but they're also very revealing. The British claim a sighting around 1592. But, historical records pretty strongly suggest an Iberian presence was there much earlier.
Earlier than 1592.
Much earlier. We have maps, like Pedro Reynel's from 1522, that show the islands. And even more importantly, a Spanish expedition in 1540 actually made landfall for several days. That might seem minor, but it's a much more concrete act of presence than just sailing by.
But the first actual settlement, the first non-indigenous people to live there, they weren't Spanish or British. They were French.
They were French. Louis-Antoine de Bougainville sets up Port Louis in 1764. But that French presence actually ends up strengthening Spain's legal case.
How so?
Well, because in 1767, the French voluntarily transferred the settlement to Spanish control. Spain paid them for it, and the French navigator even went on record recognizing Spain's pre-existing rights. So it was a clear cession confirming Spanish sovereignty.
But at the same time, the British were sneaking in. They set up a secret little base at Port Egmont in 1766.
The very precarious base. And it was arguably a violation of treaties that were meant to keep the British out of Spanish domains.
And Spain didn't take that lightly.
Not at all. In 1770, they sent a big force from Buenos Aires and just removed the British base. They avoided a full-on war, but even when they let the British return temporarily in 1771, Spain made sure to include a clause, a reserve of its sovereignty over the islands.
So they were saying, you can be here for now, but we still own the place.
Precisely. And this is where the British claim of effective control hits a massive historical snag. Because just 3 years later, in 1774, Britain just abandons Port Egmont.
Why? Why would they do that after fighting to get back in?
A few things. It was expensive. Britain was getting really distracted by the brewing revolution in America. And maybe they just realized defending it wasn't worth the constant fight with Spain. All they left was a little lead plaque.
A symbolic gesture.
A symbolic gesture with no substance. And Spain immediately moved to erase it. They destroyed what was left of the British fort. And here's the crucial part. From 1774 to 1811, that's 37 years, Spain exercised continuous, exclusive, peaceful control from their capital, Puerto Soledad.
37 uninterrupted years.
Governed directly from Buenos Aires. That 37-year period is probably the single most powerful piece of evidence against the British claim of uninterrupted, effective control.
So let's fast forward to 1810. The precursor to Argentina declares independence from Spain. Under that Iudipasadetis juris doctrine, they claim to inherit that 37-year period of peaceful control.
Correct. The new state immediately starts acting like a sovereign, paying the small garrisons on the islands. When the Spanish finally pull their soldiers in 1811, it's not to give the territory away, it's to move them to fight the Patriots somewhere else. The territory was considered transferred to the new Argentine state.
And this leads to a period of pretty clear Argentine sovereignty, all centered around this colony started by a man named Luis Fernet. This wasn't just a flag on a pole, it was a real community.
A functioning civilian community. And that's critical for effective control. Fernet gets concessions in 1823. But the huge date is June 10, 1829. That's when Argentina formally creates the political and military command of the Malvinas and makes Arena the commander.
So he's a proper governor?
A governor with real powers. He's setting fishing rules for foreign ships. He's keeping a local birth register. He even registered his own daughter there, Matilde. They called her Malvina.
Wow, that's a powerful human detail.
It is. And legally, he was granting land to new pioneers. And this is key, including British citizens who agreed to live under Argentine rule. It was peaceful, it was effective, it was the high water mark of Argentina's claim.
Which brings us to January 1833, because that peaceful period comes to a very abrupt end.
It does. It was a clear act of force. The British ship HMS Clio shows up at Port Soledad.
Commanded by Captain John Onslow.
Right, and he expels the Argentine authority and the garrison. But critically, they don't just take over the military posts, they go after the civilians. A full 70% of René's colony, the established Argentine population, was forced to leave.
So that one action does two things. It ends Argentina's effective control, and it completely changes the demographics of the islands forever.
Exactly. It imposed a new occupant and started the process of repopulating the islands almost entirely with people of British origin. The ancestors of today's Kelpers.
Argentina protested immediately, of course.
They did, but the country was a mess internally, constant turmoil. They just didn't have the power to challenge Great Britain. They kept up the claim, though, on maps. They tried to get arbitration, but the UK just refused every time.
Why refuse arbitration if you feel your claim is solid?
Well, it's a classic power move, right?
Yeah.
If you're the one in control, you maintain the status quo. But then after World War II, the whole world changes. You get the era of decolonization, and the UN steps in.
And in 1965, the General Assembly passes Resolution 2065. This is a huge deal.
It's a massive diplomatic victory for Argentina because it explicitly says a sovereignty dispute exists, but there was a fatal catch in the wording.
It mentioned the interest of the inhabitants, the Kelpers.
Exactly, and that creates this impossible impasse because the Kelpers are, overwhelmingly descended from the British settlers who arrived after 1833.
So if you apply the modern principle of self-determination, they're obviously going to vote to stay British.
Right, which directly contradicts Argentina's historical claim. It's a legal trap. And that brings us to the late 1970s and the road to war. The Argentine military junta is in deep, deep trouble.
They are drowning. The years of lead, hyperinflation, political opposition, they desperately needed a distraction.
Something to unite the country. And they saw the conflict not as something they were starting, but as the tragic culmination of 150 years of British stubbornness. They used this very potent phrase, a just cause in the middle of the chest.
But the actual decision to invade was just cynical politics. General Galtieri thought taking the islands on the 150th anniversary of the 1833 takeover would basically guarantee him another 10 years in power.
An unbelievable miscalculation.
Yeah.
The plan was basically hashed out over lunch in December 1981. The invasion plan itself, Operation Rosario, was incredibly rushed.
And the military planning was fatally flawed, wasn't it? The admiral in charge raised a lot of questions.
He did. Vice Admiral Lombardo asked about defense, about what would happen after the invasion. But the leadership just assumed the British wouldn't react militarily.
They thought they would just take them.
They thought they'd take them, and then the UN or the US would step in and force a negotiation that would favor Argentina. The admiral was even told the plan was to take the islands, but not necessarily to keep them. Staggering amateurism.
And the whole thing was triggered by a provocation in the South Georgia Islands, north of the main group.
Yeah, Operation Alpha. It was the deliberate escalation. They sent naval guys disguised as scrap metalworkers to plant an Argentine flag, breaking all protocol. When they were forced to take it down, they left a small military unit behind.
Basically daring the UK to do something.
And it worked. The UK saw it as a clear breach and sent the HMS Endurance with Royal Marines. And that just ratcheted up the tension right before the main event.
April 2nd, 1982. Operation Rosario begins. The small British garrison is overwhelmed, and Port Stanley falls the next day.
The 74-day war is on. And while the British task force, Operation Corporate, was sailing 8,000 miles south, the diplomatic track was on fire. Pérez de Cuellar at the UN was working nonstop.
But the U.S. was stuck in the middle. Alexander Haig had this awful dilemma.
A terrible position.
Yeah.
Great Britain is your core NATO ally. But the Reagan administration saw the Argentine junta as a key partner against communism in Central America.
So he tried shuttle diplomacy for a few weeks.
He did, but it was hopeless. The U.S. ultimately sided firmly with Great Britain. And not just diplomatically. They were providing clandestine intelligence, satellite photos, logistics, all while negotiations were supposedly happening.
The moment it all fell apart, though, was May 2nd, the sinking of the General Belgrano.
That was the point of no return. Strategically and psychologically, it was devastating for Argentina. There's all this controversy about whether it's inside or outside the exclusion zone.
That wasn't really the point, was it?
Not really. The zone was a warning, not a hard limit. The ship was sailing away from the islands, yes, but the British still saw it as a threat. By sinking it, the UK sent a message. We will use lethal force anywhere, anytime.
And the entire Argentine Navy just went back to port.
For the rest of the war. That one act gave Britain total naval superiority and ended any real chance for a negotiated settlement.
Still, the British task force took heavy losses. The HMS Sheffield being hit by an Exocet missile really showed the vulnerability of modern warships.
Oh, absolutely. They lost 7 ships in total, 9 planes to enemy action. It was not a walk in the park. The land war was incredibly harsh.
British infantry landed at Port St. Charles and had to fight their way east. Battles at Goose Green, Darwin.
Fierce resistance. But the final surrender came on June 14th in Port Stanley.
The human cost was stark. Almost 650 Argentine soldiers killed, over 1,600 wounded. For the UK, 255 killed, over 700 wounded.
You know, this raises an interesting question about the rest of Latin America. There was this treaty, the TIR, which is basically their version of NATO's Article 5, mutual defense.
So did anyone actually help Argentina?
Almost no one, except, and this was kept secret for decades, Peru. The Peruvian president, a Democrat, decided that solidarity against what he saw as British colonialism was more important than his disgust for the Argentine junta.
Wow, so what did they do?
They secretly sent Argentina 10 Mirage fighter jets, which they desperately needed. They even left the base in Peru already painted with Argentine markings. They tried to send Exocet missiles too, but British intelligence blocked that. It was a remarkable act of solidarity.
So looking at the immediate aftermath for the Argentine junta, the defeat was catastrophic.
Absolutely fatal. The euphoria was gone, replaced by massive protests. It led directly to the fall of the military government in 1983 and the return of democracy.
And for Margaret Thatcher, it was the exact opposite.
The exact opposite. Her government had been struggling. This massive, decisive military victory turned her into the Iron Lady and basically secured her power for years.
The long-term legacy is, well, it's still so complicated. Relations were restored in 1989, but under this thing called the sovereignty umbrella.
Which just means they agree to talk about things like fishing and oil, but they also agree to not talk about who owns the islands. The core dispute is just set aside.
So Argentina continues to protest at the UN, and the issue just stays frozen.
It remains politically active, yes, unresolved.
So we're left with this fundamental clash. If the principle of self-determination for the people living there now is the main obstacle, how do you weigh that against the historical legal claim of iuda possidetis juris, especially when you know that the demographics on the islands today were directly caused by that single act of force back in 1833? What really stands out to you?